So great, thanks so much, everyone. So we'll open it up to questions for discussion now, and also hopefully the panelists can reflect on each other's remarks also during their responses. We'll take questions maybe in groups of 3, and for those online, I have the iPad in front of me, so if you want to send through questions now, we'll hopefully be able to put those to the panel as well. So just raise your hand if you have a question to ask. And if you could just introduce yourself, your name and your affiliation, that would be great. So we'll start over there with Nick, and then the gentleman in the gray sweater, and then the gentleman in the front row. Great.
Hi there, Nick Godfrey. I'm with New Climate Economy, work very closely with Michael and Russell over the last few years. And I also look after our cities programme. I had two questions, really. I hope you don't mind. Carlotta, Michael, it's a fantastic book. One question is, I'm a macroeconomist by training, and I studied undergraduate economics, appallingly taught. It was literally nuts and bolts economic modelling, models. There was a total absence of economic history. And then I moved on to looking at development economics, an absolute transformation because you're actually looking at economic history. I guess my question is, what do we do to fix the economics profession? Because ultimately, what I totally buy into your argument, but ultimately it cannot be tackled with, at the heart of our economic system is the way that economics is taught. Second question is just your point about urbanization. What we found in our work is this model of urban sprawl, particularly in the US, which is the most sprawled country in the world. It seems to have a profound impact on inequality, actually, as well, which is not necessarily well understood. And it has a profound impact on environmental performance. And I guess, Carlotta, I just wanted to get your view on how do we start to shift that model and transform that model away from something which is more economically, socially, and environmentally productive.
Great.
Hi, my name is Avi Bram. I'm an economist at DFID. Thank you all for very interesting talks there. My question was for Carlotta. I was really just interested in getting your reaction to kind of Paul Mason's thesis in Post-Capitalism. He sort of follows you in his economic history analysis of these long cycles, the upswings, downswings from new technologies and their deployment and so on. But as you probably know, he's got a very different view on this current cycle where he believes that the nature of IT is so fundamentally different to all the technology we've had before, the kind of zero marginal costs, basically, that you can now produce at zero marginal cost, and this essentially undermines the basis of capitalism. So instead of this new upswing being based on sort of state direction, inspiring or coordinating private enterprise towards better use of these technologies, actually the role of private enterprise at all will sort of inevitably fade away, if you like, or at least for the sort of capitalist private enterprise, the corporations that we've been used to. So a bit long-winded, but I hope you can reflect on those, please.
Great, thank you. If you just pass the microphone forward.
Thank you. My name is Serhiy Kiral, and I'm actually from Ukraine. I'm a member of parliament, so I'm a policymaker, as you. And I really appreciate EBRD and your support you provide to my country, which makes you probably the largest investor in infrastructure, in the basic infrastructure you're talking about. I really appreciate your presentations, and my question would be related to Eastern Europe and the countries of the post-socialist bloc, which in fact hasn't yet made any significant progress in building the capitalism which you are now trying to rethink, which you would call the developing countries or countries in transition. But we have always been looking at the example of the West, of the free world, and trying to take note and take those patterns and adapt it to the situation in Ukraine, in our country. it hasn't been really successful. And my opinion, one of the reasons is because of the very weak state as we have. I mean, the lack of rule of law and lack of strong institutions. So I was wondering what would be your advice, but also for the policymakers in European Union, United States, where we are very much dependent right now, in particular, where we are fighting a war with Russia, and we are trying at the same time to do the necessary reforms and build a successful democratic rule of law based state. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much for those questions. In the interest of time, if we can just go across the panelists, if you could each decide sort of what parts of those questions you want to answer around how we fix the economics profession, the implications for urbanization, the issue of IT, ICT and technologies and the role of the state, and then lastly around this issue of the question of the role of the implications for countries and policymakers in perhaps weaker states. We have 10 minutes, 8 minutes left, so we'll try to go through these questions. But what I would suggest is, because we started a bit late, if everyone's happy, we'll run about 10 minutes over. If the panelists are also okay with that, then we can do one more round of questions. And we have coffee and tea outside, so you can continue the conversation after that. Yeah.
Goodness.
Sorry, I wasn't very good at stopping people from speaking because it was too interesting.
Well, the suburban sprawl is a huge problem. I imagine that, the US has a much bigger problem than Europe, because there they went much further, especially they have so much land, so it was crazy. So I think maybe one of the things to do in the US is actually to turn all those suburban things into more active, not just sleeping places, but to have wealth creation there in order to be able to keep, I don't know. It's a huge problem. I'd be frightened I wouldn't want to be the person in charge of doing this, because that's the problem. Each technological revolution leaves a huge legacy. We're dealing with consumerism, with waste, with all that, and with suburbia. So how do we face one or the other? Each one has to be faced differently, taking advantage of this. And I think I'd better answer the one that's really directed to me, which is Paul's view of post-capitalism. Okay. I actually do think that many of the things that Paul sees as post-capitalism are part of this new thing. I think somebody in the 30s who had been told that we would have a welfare state, they would have said it's post-capitalism. In fact, the Marxists changed the name to state something capitalism. They sort of thought it was a huge change because the state was taking a role that was much bigger. So I think because society will take a role that's much bigger, I think maybe what we will get is the sharing economy, all those things to be a complement to the things that will have to be in big companies, which, like all the Googles and the Teslas and all these guys, even if they have zero marginal cost, they are working as huge corporations. So we can have a dual economy where we have the high productivity, big corporations, competitive across the world. And then we have community level, very strong strategy, local governments that would favor a much more socially active society, sharing and doing all these wonderful things that would make the quality of life locally much better. I doubt that we're going to post-capitalism. I think the strength of capitalism is still enormous, and I wish we could say there's something really lovely ahead. I don't think there is. What I've said, it sounds like lovely, but it's not as lovely as I think Paul looks ahead to. So I do think private capitalism will continue, but there will be this combination which will make it different and maybe better.
Okay. Michael, do you want to respond to some of the
Well,
questions?
just coming back, one of the things that Paul Mason is famous for saying, which I think everybody has realised was wrong, it was about the so-called sharing economy and the gig economy. And what we've learnt in the short period since the publication of Paul Mason's book is that this is a very typically capitalist formation, in which resources are capital resources are mobilised and then labour is exploited as far as it's possible for capitalism to do it. And the sharing economy doesn't look nearly so nice as it's made out in his book, for very obvious capital formation reasons. And what capitalists are good at is mobilising ideas and capital. Uber is a very, very interesting phenomenon, because Uber is not using... It's always thought of as a technology company. It's not a technology company. The technologies of Uber have been pre-invented by others, and they've just applied them with a business. It's a business model innovation. And the business model is classic capitalist business model, which is to find workers as cheaply as possible and pay them the absolute minimum and put all the risks of their employment onto them. Uber is the equivalent of the dockers of the dock work in the 1930s, in which you have, at least in those days, you get a day's work when you stand at the dock and so on. And now you can get an hour's work here or there in the new flexible economy. So I think we should be very careful about thinking that capitalism is easily undermined by technology. The great thing about capitalism, if you're a capitalist, is how easy it is, or how flexible capitalist forms can be in taking new technologies and so on. That doesn't mean that there aren't interesting things happening out within the economy, but I think this is... And automation is comparable. Automation will destroy jobs, but it will also create huge amounts of value, which will then need to be recirculated in the economy to create new jobs. And we don't have there is no a priori reason why automation of itself, these new technologies, should lead to some dramatic reduction in the number of available jobs. It depends on how the incomes are recirculated. And if the income remains within the holders of capital and it's not recirculating the economy, then you could certainly get that. But if it's and this is where the state becomes so important. And this then brings us to the question of Ukraine. I'd love to hear your take on all of this, but the point that you make, which is about weak state and weak institutions, does seem to me to be critical in this. In the period of installation and the creative destruction period, capitalist firms and financial markets will explode, and if the conditions are right, can generate lots of growth. In the period of deployment, you need the state, and the state has to provide this direction. And that does need strong and legitimate institutions. And where you have weak states and weak institutions, it's hard to do that. Now, we have, interestingly, in the UK, a kind of another version of that, which is weak regional institutions. So we have a strong, relatively strong national state, but we have very weak regional institutions, subnational institutions, unlike most developed economies, which have much stronger institutions at subnational level. And my suspicion is that for a lot of economic policy, particularly in matching demand and supply, providing infrastructure, skills, what we would now call industrial strategy, needs a lower level of government. A national 50 million, 55, 60 million people is too large. And most other countries that have reasonably successful intermediating state institutions in economic policy do it at a much lower level. Obviously, where there's weaker national institutions, you've got a double problem. And you've obviously had, in Eastern Europe, you've had sort of kleptocratic government, which has allowed huge amounts of capital to be expropriated and so on. I don't know enough about economies in transition to be able to offer any advice, but certainly I would absolutely accept that the role of public institutions is absolutely critical in this. And this is why a lot of our book, Carlotta's work, suggests that you need a much more active state in this period in order to gather all the conditions together and drive them in a direction, and that then enables capitalists to make money out of it, but they're not going to do so or on their own. I'll take Nick's other point about teaching economics. This is a problem. So we have a self-reinforcing process within the profession of economics, in which, in order to become a top economist, you have to publish in the journals, which are edited by and have referees from the orthodoxy. It then becomes very difficult to rise within the profession as a non-orthodox economist. However, economics is not completely immune to evidence, and one of the things that's happened over the last 10 years, it's largely immune to evidence, actually. It's an extraordinary science, social science, in the sense that it's paid much, much less attention, just structurally, to the evidence base, and it's to facts, actually, and to economic history. And it's been much more interested in the theoretical elegance of its, and because many economists are failed mathematicians, otherwise known as applied mathematicians, people who like maths, it's gone for elegance over science, actually, over the relationship between the evidence base and the theory. And so economics has a kind of structural problem in it, but there is now much more criticism of economics, and economists are beginning to note this themselves. And Andy Haldane, the chief economist of the Bank of England's speech the other day, in which he noted that economics has had a serious problem, is beginning to make an inroad. And the interesting thing is that the students have rebelled. So we've now got rebellious students in various universities who are saying that the syllabus we've been taught is not adequate. We want to know actually about the real economy. Started in Manchester with the post-crash economics and so on. So there's a bit of movement going on there. And the field of economics does have lots of heterodox economists in it. It's not like we don't know what to think about this. There's a lot of good interesting economics out there, but it'll take a while before that becomes a new orthodoxy. But that was true of Keynesianism too. A lot of economists were absolutely hooked on the kind of classical economics that prevailed in the 1930s, and it took a while. The interesting thing, of course, is we haven't had the Keynes figure who kind of brings it all together. And if you look at all the heterodox economists, there isn't anybody who's kind of bringing it all together and is acting as the new kind of lodestar of but that may still happen. Carlotta still has time to be that person, if only.
Can I clarify just one thing about the about the sharing economy? I don't think that Uber deserves that name. They used it, but it's not. I think there is a collaborative economy, which is very different, and that's what I'm calling the sharing economy that will coexist. So just in case, I definitely think Uber has to be controlled and all that. It's not. Mm-hmm.
Russell, do you want to react to any of their questions?
Yeah, great. Well, just picking up what my colleague from Ukraine has said, and just building on what Michael said. In our previous work at the New Climate Economy, prior to going to try and give advice to developing countries, which is fraught with difficulties, we started to say, well, what features are present in effective policy reform? One of which is state capacity, and that comes out every time there has been successful policy reform, is you have a strong state to deliver it. And so so agreed, and I don't think that's disputed in the literature. A few other things that are always seem to be present, and again, the team at ODI here, I think, are excellent in terms of collecting this evidence, and more people, it needs to get out there and more people need to read it. So a few other factors. Firstly, and I mentioned this before, is political commitment around whatever the direction of change is. The second is consensus around whatever the direction of change is. If you have a lack of consensus, it tends to make it difficult to actually move forward on whatever the specific issue is. And there's, of course, lots of examples of that, climate change being one of them. But I think luckily with climate change over the last few years, there's been a growing consensus around that there needs to be action. Third is coalitions, and coalitions of actors that can help build that consensus. And it's not enough just for one group in society to want something. The more groups of society that want a specific direction, the easier it is to drive through policy reform. And then lastly, I think it's focused policy design that is reactive to changes and understanding as you begin to implement. And again, I think you see there's some really great examples of that across the developing world, where the more focused something is and the more it reacts to real-time information, the more effective it is.
Great. We're about 5 minutes over, so I'll just take a couple more questions for those of you who can stay with us. So the gentleman in the front row first, the woman in the front row here, and then Ipek in the second row. And then if you can all respond quickly to these questions, and then we'll break for coffee and tea.
Andrew Ross from Global Garden. It's a question for Michael, but also following Russell's remarks. The finance market itself is fully aware of these facts, and in particular the insurance industry, looking at climate change and its impact on their liabilities. Now, in this market, green bonds are booming. They cannot find investable projects at scale that have got a reliable return on investment from a creditworthy issuer. And you've got the sheer example of cities perfectly capable of issuing municipal green bonds. Now, in this country, we have the National Infrastructure Commission, which is taking evidence from the Natural Capital Committee and applying natural capital economics to value these externalities as part of the infrastructure investment. Why isn't that a cause of optimism?
Great. If you can pass the microphone along to the woman in the purple jumper. Great.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for all your contributions. I'm Valerie Amato. I'm an independent advisor advising academia, businesses, and international NGOs on how they can work together for a better world. I have some question about thinking and rethinking, because it seems that our old models of thinking are completely out of date. We need major reform in terms of education and inviting people to work together. And so I'm wondering what the panel thinks on the relevance of system thinking in accelerating the implementation of this transformative agenda.
Great. If you can pass it just right behind you.
Thank you very much. This is Ipek Gençsu from the Climate and Energy team, and I've also been working with Michael and Russell on the new climate economy. I have a question about the power and politics side of what you've been discussing. You've all referred to it in some form, and Michael was involved in the sort of political process in the lead up to the Paris Agreement, where one of the things that he discussed with the team was how the different stakeholders came together, whether that was NGOs, academics, businesses, governments, to lead to this major achievement. How can we think about the economic transition or the thinking transition that we need to achieve in the same way? How can we make sure that the people who are disappointed with some of the political changes, some of the economic realities of today, who are motivated to change the thinking, can come together in a sort of fertile way to make sure that they are behind the governments and the policymakers who are trying to shift the next few decades in the right direction, so to speak.
Great. Thank you so much. If you don't mind, Russell, I'll start with you and we'll work our way the other direction this time. And thanks all of you for staying.
Yeah. To pick up on the systems thinking point. We were asked in the new climate economy by the Ministry of Finance in the government of Uganda to advise on the issues of sustainable and inclusive growth. They said, we have a long-term vision. Can you provide evidence that inclusivity and sustainability actually make sense for our economy? And it dawned on me during this advice what types of questions you need to develop an answer to be able to convince someone, and what types of evidence you might need to collect to do it. So we went simply with the answers to these questions. Is this path good for growth and jobs? Because that was the key political pressure in that country, and therefore we needed to provide an answer to that question. How much is this going to cost? And what exactly needs to be done in terms of policies, and is it politically palatable or not? Those were the fundamental questions that we were looking to address. Now, when you get down into how am I going to provide the evidence of this, it really did require a number of different lines of thought to actually do this. And it was very difficult in practice, actually. So picking up on looking out 30, 40 years and what this might do to GDP growth and the sources of this, it was very difficult to try and input in the models that we were using, and they were predominantly models that had been developed over a number of years by the government of Uganda, to try and think about technology in the context of a macroeconomic model, for example. Very difficult. That work, which is publicly available, tried to also take into account the role of economic geography. And Michael, I don't think that's something that you mentioned in your remarks, and it really builds on work by Krugman and Tony Venables, which says how does economic activity play out through space. And that was actually very important in this context, about saying, well, how regionally will development happen, and what types of issues do we need to think about? So I think this systems thinking is very difficult when in practice to do, and we need to develop models and methods that are actually quite practical for policymakers to use.
Great, thanks, Russell. Michael?
So systems thinking, yes. I think there's a lot under that heading. We definitely need to be more conscious of the way systems work. And in a sense, underpinning the book is a sense of capitalism as a system and not simply as a set of equations. And understanding the way systems work, and systems are different. One of the things that is very striking is that different economies, different institutional forms result in different kinds of outcomes. And you've really got to understand the kinds of institutions, the kind of firms, the kinds of markets, and so on that generate different kinds of outcomes. I think the finance markets are a source of optimism. So far, this is a wider conversation. So far, the green bond market has been identifying things that probably might have been financed anyway. It's how far it's generating funds that are going into new things, but it is definitely shifting perceptions in that market. And you're absolutely right that there's a shortage of fundable projects, and this is one of the major efforts in the whole world of global energy infrastructure, as you know, which is to try and get bankable projects in places that need them. But I do think that the way in which the finance sector has responded on climate change is a source of optimism. However, the rest of the finance sector is still creating bubbles and is still generating huge amounts of a lot of transactions which don't feed the real economy. And the problem of the finance sector not investing in the rest of the economy remains. I think you're right that there is optimism in its particular response to climate change.
Insurance has got the problem.
Well, the insurance markets have internalized the problem because it's their problem, and so the insurance companies are the ones at the frontier of this because they are well aware that they have multiple risks. They have risks of climate impacts affecting the things they're insuring, the buildings they're insuring, the cities they're insuring. They also have risks in their own investments, which are very heavily in property. So they are, and so on. So they are increasingly conscious. So I would agree with you on that. On power and politics, Beck, you asked the toughest question, of course, and the question that we should now really spend another couple of hours discussing. There was a moment during the Occupy protests post the crash in events in certain countries where it looked like the reaction to the crisis of the economy politically would be a political reaction that turned left. It was a very short moment, and it was one of the most badly organised resistance kind of oppositional movements that there has been in the post-war period. It was a terrible, terrible missed opportunity for a whole variety of reasons. And of course, since then, the dominant reaction has been right-wing. So Brexit is not in itself a right-wing vote, but it is clearly interpretable in that form, and some of the xenophobia and other things that emerged in that campaign appear to be that kind, and certainly it looks like an inward-looking, not an outward-looking thing. Trump is definitely a reactionary kind of politics. And so these things are possible, as we know from the 1930s, which saw very, very strong reactions of both left and right. In the 1930s, you had huge movements towards the left as well as towards the right. So this is a very difficult moment. Don't be under any doubt, however, that Brexit and Trump are reactions to the same set of facts and the same economic conditions. And it's one of the failures of the left to kind of talk about Brexit and Trump as if they are basically responding to a kind of rightward move. They're a right-wing political reaction to a set of conditions which people on the left should be very, very concerned about. The stagnation of wages over 40 years in the US, over the last 15 in the UK, are the kinds of for people on the bottom half of the income distribution, are things that people on the left and progressive politics should absolutely be concerned about. But you can react to them in different ways. The answer is I don't know any more than you do, but I do think that it's critical to mobilise around a set of alternative ideas of what the future could be like. The right-wing prospectus is very narrow, and it will almost certainly fail. It's very hard to see how either Brexit as a kind of response or Trump, with his very confused economic policies, are likely to succeed. And that means that the development of an alternative set of economic ideas with an alternative set of actors around them, both in civil society and in business, is really important. And that process, we have to develop some consensus. And the difficulty is developing consensus about radical ideas tends to be harder than developing about moderate ideas. it's harder to get consensus around the kind of radical things that now need to happen. Particularly in the business community, you get kind of people just about willing to see that something should be done, but it's hard to do, it's much harder to do it. But that is the task now, and it is the task for the reconstruction when the current moments fail. And I think it's very likely that politically the current expressions of political of the reaction to this moment on the right wing of politics will succeed. So we have to be ready, but it's a long-term process, and it consists of both of ideas and of coalition building.
Great, thanks, Michael. We're at just past a quarter past, so if I can ask Carlotta to give a very quick last reaction.
Very brief. I'll just pick up on all those things. I don't think it's possible to have a successful transition that's not a positive sum game between business and society. We've got to find a way that will be good for business and good for people, and not just in one country or in 5 countries, but globally. So first of all, we need that. And what does that mean? We need to build a new coalition, which is a coalition that includes business, the insurance people, the circular economy people, and as many business parts of society can understand. We need the politicians understanding precisely the things that are happening that are very serious. We need to do a sort of new covenant, like the social democracy covenant was. We've got to invent a new one that fits. So we have to get the labor unions that are interested in jobs, and we have to make sure that they understand that this is the way to get jobs. And of course, the Greens on board, so we need a very wide coalition. And if we don't get that, we're not getting the change. And that means also globally countries, and it's a very complex process, but we've got to be able to present it in a way that it can be bought by both business and society and by politicians. And I hope we get some leaders like Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Beveridge and people like that. We need not just academic economists that will do it, but fantastic politicians, which we don't have, unfortunately.
Great, thank you all very much. It was a fascinating talk. Do you have some books?
I've got some books here.
Okay, Michael has some books, so there'll be some
available
outside.
at a discounted price, so if anybody wants one.
And look forward to continuing the conversation over coffee and in many years to come so that we build this consensus and all of these new coalitions that are needed. Thank you so much.